Hi folks. At the end of last year, so at the end of 2024, I conducted the inaugural survey of this audience's favourite science fiction books, and people gave me their top 10 and then I ranked them, and we've done 2 videos so far. One for the top 75 highest scoring books from the entire audience, and then I did another video looking at the top 50 books that were published in the 21st century, again based on the survey results. So those 2, naturally enough, are focused on the highest scoring, the most popular books amongst the folks that responded to the survey anyway. And I thought it would be interesting instead to look at the books that scored the lowest. It's quite easy to dismiss those as well. They only scored 1 point. But if you think about it, one person in their responses to the survey had that one book as their 10th choice in their top 10 science fiction of all time. So it's pretty high scoring for that individual. And I have looked through them. There are about 55 in that category, that 1 point category. And I've had a look through them all, and I've picked out 15 that seem the most interesting to me for one reason or another. And so let's get into that. So the first of these books is The Witches of Klara by James H. Schmitz, which is a space opera, and I forget when it was published. In fact, I'll put the book title and the year it was published on the screen, so I won't have to keep referring to that. So I don't know much about this book other than what it says in the summary on the blurb. So for this book, no good deed goes unpunished. Captain Poor Cert thought that his luck had finally turned, but he did not yet realise it was a turn for the worse. On second thought, make that a turn for the disastrous. Unlucky in love, unsuccessful in business, he thought that he'd finally made good with his battered starship Venture, cruising across the fringes of the Empire and successfully selling off oddball cargoes which no one else had been able to sell. He was all set to return home, where his true love was faithfully waiting for him, he hoped. But then he made the fatal mistake of freeing 3 slave children from their masters, who were suspiciously eager to part with them. They were just trying to be helpful, but those 3 adorable little girls quickly made Post Cert the mortal enemy of his fiancée, his home planet the Empire, warlike Syrians, psychopathic Aldanians, the dread pirate chieftain Laius Yango, and even the worm world, the darkest threat to mankind in all of space. And all because those harmless-looking little girls were in fact 3 of the notorious and universally feared Witches of Klara. A number of people have mentioned that book to me in the past as something I should get hold of, and actually thought I had a copy, but I can't find it anywhere on my shelf, so I think perhaps I've just imagined that and I don't at all have a copy. For all of these books, actually, before we go on, if you have read it, you have an opinion that you'd like to share, then do let me know in the comments down below, whether it's good or bad. The next book is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne, which I'm sure I've read. I've certainly read several of his books when I was in my youth. Anyway, this is a classic science fiction book by the French writer Jules Verne, and originally published in 1870, I think. The description of Nemo's ship, the Nautilus, was considered to be ahead of its time, describing pretty accurately features which still exist today on modern submarines, which at the time were very primitive vessels indeed. So despite the fact that it was written in the 1870s, it's aged pretty well, certainly better than some of his other works like Journey to the Centre of the Earth, which are not scientifically plausible or accurate in any way, shape or form, and are your basic adventure novels and fun for all that. The third book on my little list here is Radix by A.A. Attanasio, and I haven't read any of his books. I think I've only got one on my shelves, and Radix I think was his first novel, if I remember rightly. So this is set in the far future, I think 13 centuries in the future, and the protagonist, Summer Kagan, is searching the Earth to find the God Mind, a malefic being, whatever that is, with reality-shaping powers, apparently. I was interested to read some of the reviews on Goodreads, and here are some quotes. Brilliant, or a train wreck. And the second one was, what the hell is this guy on? And then somebody else, I think, waxing lyrical on it being a brave attempt, but not quite achieving what he thought the author was setting out to achieve. He did say that the attempt is pretty amazing. So I think it's one of these books where it's better to reach for the stars and fail rather than be unambitious. But it does seem to divide people's opinions. The overall kind of rating is pretty high, as I recall. And this is a book that I probably ought to have read by now, so I should be looking out for a copy of it. And here's another book which I feel in my bones I ought to have read by now, and probably have, but I certainly don't remember much about it, and I've got the sort of vague notion of the plot, but really I couldn't tell you other than the obvious. And I think maybe it's like almost like a folk memory of reading it when I haven't. I've just osmosed it over the decades. This is a cautionary horror story about the dangers of greed and isolation and a science without ethics, from, of course, H.G. Wells, considered by many to be the father of contemporary science fiction. A stranger arrives early in February one wintry day through a biting wind and a driving snow, and he's wrapped up from head to foot, and the brim of his hat hides every inch of his face. Rude and rough, the stranger works with strange apparatus locked in his room all day and walks along lonely lanes at night, his bandaged face inspiring fear in children and, bizarrely, dogs. Is he the mutilated victim of an accident, a criminal on the run, an eccentric genius? But no one in the village comes close to guessing who has come amongst them or what those bandages hide. So the next book is non-fiction. It's The Science in Science Fiction by Peter Nichols. This apparently is an illustrated survey of the actual science behind recent science fiction and investigates the frontiers of contemporary scientific knowledge, or at least it was contemporary at the time it was written. I don't know when that was. It discusses the viability of the ideas which science fiction writers commonly exploit, things like time travel, hyperspace or cloning, describing how these things might be achieved in the future and the steps scientists are currently taking to make fact out of fiction. And it looks like it's got a Chris Foss cover, and the listing on Amazon strongly implies it's illustrated by Chris Foss. So I imagine the interior illustrations for that are quite good. It's the sort of book that I would have borrowed from my school library when I was a kid. So I might actually seek a copy of that. I think that would be quite interesting. The next one-point book is Spaceman Blues, a love story by Brian Francis Slattery. We follow a chap called Wendell Apogee. And when his friend Manuel Rodrigo de Guzman Gonzalez disappears, Wendell decides to find out where he's gone and why. But in order to find out what happened to Manuel, Wendell must contend with parties, cockfights, slightly bizarrely, and chases, an underground city whose people live in houses suspended from cavern ceilings, urban weirdos and alien assassins, immigrants and religious cults. Spaceman Blues is a literary retro pulp science fiction mystery superhero novel, allegedly, the debut of a true voice of the future and a cult classic in the making. And about this book, Harlan Ellison, none other, says, "What a breathless, mad tornado of words. When it shakes itself awake, the earth trembles and the helpless reader is dragged gladly into its light." I haven't had this much fun with a book in years. All right, Harlan, take it easy. So that does sound intriguing. That might be something that I might like to read, actually. So I'm going to look out for that, I think. The next one is another old book, I think from the early 1930s by Czech author Karel Čapek. I haven't read anything by him. And in fact, I hadn't heard of him until fairly recently. So my ears pricked up, as it were, when I saw this book listed. In this book, man apparently discovers a species of giant intelligent newts and learns to exploit them so successfully that the newts gain skills and arms enough to challenge man's place at the top of the animal kingdom. It's a political satire, mainly. It's written at a time of the rise of National Socialism or Nazism in Germany, which obviously had pretty dire results for Czechoslovakia in the late 1930s. Yeah, there's a quote here. "The book is a dark satire, poking fun extensively at the contemporary European politics, including colonialism, fascism and Nazism, segregation in America and the arms race." And apparently there's a notable satirical point where the research of a German scientist is mentioned, and apparently he's determined that German newts are actually a superior Nordic race, and that as such they have a right to expand their living space at the expense of inferior breeds of newts, which all sounds a little bit direct and on the nose. The next book is Black Cloud by Fred Hoyle, and I do actually have a copy of this, but I haven't actually read it yet. It was written in the late 1950s, and it's a classic of hard science fiction by Fred Hoyle, who was an astronomer and cosmologist, so he was no slouch when it comes to the actual science. And this book is set in the early 60s, and astrophysicists on Earth have become aware of a cloud of gas and dust, initially thought to be a Bok globule, whatever that is. It's heading for the solar system. The cloud interposes itself between the sun and the Earth, and if it stays there for any length of time, it could cause us real problems, wiping out most of life by blocking solar radiation. Hence the name, the Black Cloud. And a crack team of astronomers and other scientists is drawn together in Nortonstow in England, wherever that is. Well, I know where England is, I just don't know where Nortonstow is, to study the cloud and to report to the British government about the consequences of its presence, which is rather quaint. The behaviour of the cloud can't be predicted scientifically, and eventually the Nortonstow scientists come to the conclusion that it might be a life form with a degree of intelligence, and perhaps it can be persuaded to change its behaviour. It's a hoary old classic at this point. I haven't yet read any Fred Hoyle, and I really should, because I do like a bit of hard science fiction from time to time. The next book is Virtual Girl by Amy Thompson from 1993, and this one caught my interest because of another book, The Colour of Distance by Amy Thompson, which is on the Broderick and DeFilippo Best 101 Novels from whenever it was, 1985 to 2010. And apparently, in an illegal experiment, Arnold develops the perfect companion, a robot named Maggie. She's everything that he ever wanted in a woman. But when they become separated, Maggie learns more about people and herself than Arnold plans. Soon, she must decide if she's just a collection of microchips or a person in her own right. If we think of a couple of movies, AI and Ex Machina, They sort of hark back to this same question of, when does an artificial intelligence become sentient and aware, and should they be people in their own right? And will owning them become tantamount to slavery in the future? The next book made me really giggle because I'd completely forgotten that they exist, but I borrowed and re-borrowed this series of books from the library when I was a kid, and I haven't seen one since in the wild, but if I do, I will certainly grab one. So the first book in this series is called Total War by Jerry Ahern, and the series is called The Survivalist. There are almost 30 of them, I think 29, and they're pretty pulpy. John Rourke is the protagonist. He's an ex-CIA officer turned weapons and survival expert, and he's a handy guy to know because the books are set in the aftermath of, you guessed it, a nuclear war. And the first few books cover Rourke's attempt to find his family and on the way fighting invading Soviet troops, as well as the typical post-apocalyptic villains such as biker gangs, mutants and cannibals in extended scenes of graphic violence, which of course was what appealed to me as a teenager. There's lots of weapons and detailed descriptions of guns. And as I recall, the later books head more into science fiction territory. There's some cryonics, there's some bit of time travel, there are doomsday weapons, and even underwater cities. There are future Nazis and future communists, and they are schlocky, pulpy fun, but I recall loving them. They probably don't stack up that well anymore, but I'd be amused to read one if I can find one. Okay, the next book is Kiln People by David Brin, and this takes place in a future where people can create clay duplicates called dittos or golems of themselves. A ditto contains all of the memories of the original, the archetype, until the time of duplication. But there's a catch. The duplicate only lasts about a day, and the original person, the archetype, referred to it in the book as an archie, can therefore choose whether or not to upload the ditto's memories. Most people use dittos to do their work, as they are affordable even for the poor, which sounds good. And perhaps unsurprisingly, many also use dittos to experience pleasure, which might hurt a real person. Dittos come in many colours, which signify their quality and intended role. A cheap ditto suitable for housework is green, whereas a quality one for business is grey. Ebonies are highly specialised dittos that are good at intelligent data analytics, and platinums are only used by the very rich and closely resemble real people. Ivory dittos specialise in the reception of pleasure and sexual fulfilment, and other colours of dittos such as purple, red and yellow exist but are rarely mentioned in the book. So in this perilous future where disposable duplicate bodies fulfill every legal and illicit whim of their decadent master's life is cheap. No one knows that better than Albert Morris, a brash investigator with a knack for trouble, who has sent his own dittos, his own duplicates, into deadly peril more times than he cares to remember. So that sounds intriguing. I've only read one David Brin novel, and that was a collaboration with Gregory Benford. I think it was In the Heart of the Comet, which I enjoyed, but it was difficult to tell which bits were Brin and which were Benford. The next is Galaxias by Stephen Baxter, the Don of British hard SF. And in this book, by the middle of the 21st century, we've kind of sorted our shit out. We've managed to overcome a series of catastrophic events, and we maintain some sense of stability. Space exploration has begun again, and science has led the way. But then one day the sun goes out, solar panels are useless, and the world begins to freeze. And the Earth even begins to fall out of its orbit. The end is nigh. Someone or something has sent us a sign. But who are they, and why, and what for, and what can we do about it? That seems to be the premise of this book. And from a quick glance at the reviews on Goodreads, it gets mixed reviews, to say the least. The people that didn't like it a lot say that it's basically a lot of meetings. People attend lots of meetings. Nothing much really happens. And slightly worryingly for me, he's compared by a couple of people to Arthur C. Clarke, which unfortunately isn't a great recommendation given my recent Clarke reading experience. I do actually own a copy of Galaxias, but maybe I'm not in quite as much of a hurry to read that as I might otherwise have been right now. But I am intrigued by the premise. I mean, there's a bunch of books, like Greg Egan's Quarantine springs to mind, where the entire solar system is enclosed suddenly in a bubble, and that has implications. Ghost in the Machine type thing, a science fiction trick, if you like, to flip the table and see what happens. Okay, anyway, the next book is A Matter for Men by David Gerrold, which is the first in the War Against the Cthor, which I've heard of but never read. I don't have any of them either. But apparently it's a series, I think, unfinished. I think he'd initially intended it to be a trilogy, but as is the way of these things, sometimes it became more and more intricate and it was going to need more books. And I think he's expecting it to be 7, but I don't think that I don't think it's complete. You tell me if that's not the case, but according to my secret sources, or Wikipedia, it is not yet complete. But the premise of this tale is that there's been a mysterious and deadly virus that's wiped out most of the world's population, and there's now an entire ecosystem of strange and violent alien creatures dubbed the Cthor that have started to appear. The narrator and protagonist is Jim McCarthy, and his buddy Ted Jackson are both half-trained researchers that are attached to a squad of soldiers who are tasked with clearing the Colorado wilderness of nests of large and predatory worms, one of the better-known species of Cathorans. Is it Cathorans or Chatorans? I think it's probably Chatorans. Anyway, whatever. It's impossible to pronounce that, I think. And they find a nest and they bring back both eggs and millipedes, whatever they are, baby worms probably, for further analysis. But after a further unsettling encounter with a family of nesting worms, he and Ted and their samples are sent to Denver, which is now the capital of the US, where Jim learns that political squabbling is getting in the way of making any real progress on countering the invasion. And Jim and his mate end up being recruited by a mysterious covert group led by somebody called Uncle Ira, who've dedicated themselves to cleaning out both the Cathor and the human political opposition to this goal at any cost. So I'm intrigued by the premise and the setup, but I don't know if I'm keen on starting a series that may never be finished. There's a definite whiff of George R.R. Martin. It's been a number of years since I think it's the 6th book is the last one to be written, but it's years since that's been published. So I don't know if people are really holding their breath for the 7th to arrive. Again, if you have read it and you think it's really good, you can let me know what I'm missing out on. Is it worth me starting that one if book 7 doesn't appear? The next book is Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, author of Remains of the Day and Never Let Me Go. And this one is another book about artificial people. In this case, from her place in the store, Klara, who's an artificial friend, capital A, capital S, with outstanding observational qualities. And she watches carefully the behaviour of those who come in to browse and of those who pass on the street outside. She remains hopeful that a customer will soon choose her, but when the possibility emerges that her circumstances may change forever, Klara is warned not to invest too much in the promises of humans. And apparently Ishiguro looks in this book at our rapidly changing modern world through the eyes of an unforgettable narrator to explore a fundamental question. What does it mean to love? This is another book that seems to get love it or hate it reviews. It's polarizing, it seems, and that can be a good thing. I think, in my experience, it's quite interesting to read books that have that divisive effect on people. There are some that compare it unfavourably to his better known books like Remains of the Day or Never Let Me Go, but I don't have a copy of it, but if I find one, I think I'm going to be inclined to buy one. Right then, to the final book in this list of 15 is Doggerland by Ben Smith, and this is one that I'd never heard of. And apparently this is a brilliantly inventive, beautifully crafted and superbly gripping debut novel about loneliness and hope, about nature and survival, and it's set in an offshore wind farm in the not-so-distant future. So they're in the North Sea and far from what remains of the coastline, and this wind farm stretches for thousands of acres. The boy, who's no longer really a boy, and the old man, whose age is unguessable, are charged with its maintenance. They carry out their never-ending work as the waves roll, dragging strange shoals of flotsam through the turbine fields. And for them, land is only a memory. So too is the boy, his father, who worked on the turbines before him and then disappeared. The boy has been sent by the company to take his place, but the question of where he went and why is one for which the old man will give no answer. As the old man dredges the sea for lost things, the boy sifts for the truth of his missing father until one day, from the limitless water, a plan for escape emerges. So I am intrigued by that. So it's a near future, something clearly dramatic has happened from a climactic point of view to change the world. And I like the premise of them being stuck out in the middle of the ocean, trying to keep these wind turbines turning. So that's the list of the 1-point books that most intrigued me from the list. I think I'll put the list of all 50 odd of them in the description for the video, so if you want to have a scan through them all yourself, you can. Obviously there was a huge swathe of books. I think this will be the last video then, exploring the entrails of the survey results from the inaugural survey, and we'll go again at the end of 2025 when I hope to run a second survey, and hopefully we'll get even more responses for that one. Do let me know if any of these books intrigue you, or if you've read them and you want to either encourage me or warn me. Do let me know in the comments. As always, it's great to hear from you. But in the meantime, thank you for watching, and until next time, goodbye for now.